Hey guys, this video is for the sophomores. All right, today we're going to talk about the birth of Jim Crow. Now, that's not a very pleasant topic, unfortunately. The birth of Jim Crow. Now, after Reconstruction ended in 1877, what this pretty much meant was that African Americans were being left completely to the devices of the white South. So basically, whatever the white South wanted to do to them, there was really no recourse at all. The North had lost its commitment. Remember, in the Compromise of 1877, the Northerners, the U.S. government removed its troops down south. So there was really no protection at all for African Americans in the South, right? So that meant that, whatever the South wanted to pass, impacting the lives of black people, they could without any repercussions. Now, the North lost its commitment, excuse me, the North lost its commitment to fighting for black freedom. So the black population in the South was subject to both political pressure, economic pressure, and actual physical pressure, violence, in order to keep the population of African Americans in the South in line. Now, economically, most black people in the South remained sharecroppers during the post Reconstruction years, and that continued until good into the 1940s. Where, remember, sharecropper was where you could farm land that belonged to a white person, but you had to share your crop with him. So he got half and you got half. Even though that half that you got, you often had to repay loans that the landowner had given you for equipment and seeds and all of that. So it really was a very, very difficult economic situation. And 75% of blacks in the South were sharecroppers. A few were tenant farmers, but you needed more money to be a tenant farmer to actually just rent the land, right? You could rent the land and keep your crop, but that took more money than actually just using white people's land and then sharing your crop with them. So that was not a very good situation economically for black people, who really, really struggled. Were very poor, desperately poor, for the most part in the South. Now, politically, the South became a bastion, complete bastion for the Democratic Party, and that term is known as the Solid South. Now, the Solid South means that the South voted solidly for the Democratic Party. It was, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say, but it was almost unanimous. Almost every white Southerner supported the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was identified with, with Lincoln, with the Union War effort, with the Civil War, with Reconstruction. So being a white Republican was unthinkable for a white Southerner. Which might sound odd considering today's politics, but it was unheard of. Every white Southerner was a Democrat. When in election time, the Democrats routinely racked up in the South 80-90% of the vote. So I guess there were a handful of white people who voted Republican, or maybe the few black people who still could vote in the South would vote Republican. But the South was solidly in control by the Democratic Party, and the thing is that continued. I know what some of you guys are probably thinking, like, when did that change? That continued, I would say, up until the 1950s, where the South voted solidly for the Democratic Party. But when the National Democratic Party became more identified with the cause of civil rights for blacks, that's what led a lot of white people in the South to begin leaving the Democratic Party. So, like, starting in the 1960s, when the Democratic Party, JFK, LBJ, Humphrey, all those Democrats were seen as very sympathetic to the needs of African Americans, a lot of white Southerners left. And the Republican Party of the time basically said, "Oh my God, look at all these potential voters we have." So the National Republican Party lured white Southerners into their party with conservative cultural appeals, not just on race, but on a lot of issues like crime and welfare and, the proper role of government, the belief in states' rights, all of that. And starting with that time, starting in the mid to late 1960s, most of the white South began going to the Republican Party, and it's that way to this day. Even white Southerners are overwhelming, not unanimously, but overwhelmingly Republican. For a Democrat basically to win the South, they basically have to rack up the black vote like this today, rack up the black vote completely, and then get maybe 30% of the white vote. If you don't do that, then you can't win a statewide election in the South. But that's a complete change. Now the South is very Republican. The South was overwhelmingly Democrat. That's why to this day, like sometimes people who are Republicans who get angry that the Republican Party is seen as a party that's not sympathetic to black people. A lot of Republicans today counter, well, most racists in American history were Democrats. The Democrats were the ones who opposed civil rights. That's technically true, but it's misleading, right? Because it was a very different party. It was a very different Democratic Party. It was a very different Republican Party back then. So most Southerners, almost all white Southerners were Democrats during the post-Reconstruction years. Interestingly, Democrats actually continued holding local offices in the South up until the 1980s. Where a lot of, even to this day, in a lot of southern states, technically, there are more registered Democrats than there are Republicans, technically. But again, that's a little misleading. A lot of people are just Democrat down south because of these old loyalties from the 19th century. And maybe local Democrats, in the South are certainly a lot more conservative than national Democrats would be. So they might vote for a Democratic state legislator, but they'd be much more reluctant to vote for a Democrat for president of the United States. Okay, now let's start talking about segregation. Now, segregation is the heart of Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow is actually a minstrel character. That's where they get the term from. Minstrel, remember when white people used to put blackface on and start dancing and acting in a very stereotypical black way? It was a very popular form of entertainment in the 19th and early 20th century. And Jim Crow was a minstrel character. Jim was kind of an insulting name for a black man in the South. I'm not sure what the origins of that are. It probably goes back to slavery. When you called someone Jim, it was kind of like a nasty term for a black man. And Crow, because Crow is a bird that's black, thus the name Jim Crow for the minstrel character, which became the name for the system of segregation in the South. Now, segregation means that white people and black people are separated in public places. So that means all public places: trolleys, trains, schools, restaurants, you name it. Everything, there had to be a separate facility for the races. Now, by the end of the 19th century, every southern state had Jim Crow laws on the books. And let's call it for what it is. I know this is a global term, but this was apartheid, right? We think of apartheid correctly as the system they had in South Africa, right? That separated white people and black people. But it was basically the same thing in the American South: forced separation of the races. Now, the whole idea was we have a white facility, we have a black facility, but the facility for black people in the South was always substandard. The schools for black children were not as good. The black facilities were not as good. The hotels and restaurants for black people were not as good. So it wasn't like all right, we have a great thing for whites, we have a great thing for blacks. It wasn't. It was kind of like we have two separate facilities, one decent one for whites and one for blacks. So this was really outrageous, and it relegated black people to second-class citizenship. Right? You couldn't sit with white people in theaters, in bathrooms, in bars, in schools, and restaurants. Basically, every part of life, public life, was separated based on race. Now, this, to a lot of people, correctly, think that segregation is a violation of the 14th Amendment. Remember, the 14th Amendment was passed during Reconstruction and said that black people are citizens of the United States and they have equal protection of the laws, right? You can, have one set of laws for whites and one set of laws for blacks. So a man named Homer Plessy was actually only an eighth black. There was actually a term for this in the South. They called a person who was eighth black an octoroon, because most southern states felt if you had any bit of black ancestry, you were black. in the eyes of the law in the South. So Homer Plessy, who was only an eighth black, and did not you're an eighth anything. It's very hard to tell somebody I'm an eighth Czech, right? Don't look Czech. So an eighth is very hard to show. So Homer Plessy actually went on a trolley, and he actually told the conductor of the trolley that he was black. And then he was saying that, well, this trolley is for white people. You can't sit here. He refused to get off, and he was arrested. And the case ultimately worked its way up to the Supreme Court, because Homer Plessy actually, in just like Rosa Parks in the 1950s, kind of provoked this. I'm not mean that in a pejorative at all. It's good. But he kind of initiated this in order to set up some sort of confrontation, which could lead to a court challenge for segregation. But unfortunately, when the case made it to the Supreme Court, in the case, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever, Plessy versus Ferguson. And this decision said that segregation is not unconstitutional. It initiated a policy called separate but equal. Just the fact that you're being separated does not mean you're being treated unequally. That's what the Supreme Court ruled, and it ruled 7-1 that segregation was legal. That segregation was not a violation of the 14th Amendment. So this is an infamous Supreme Court decision, quite rightly, right? Because it enshrined segregation. Basically, the North was just going to turn a blind eye to what they were doing to black people down south. Now, the violence, the physical pressure we're talking about against blacks was horrendous. Black people lived in fear that any breach of the racial code could lead to your death. So lynching became common in the South in order to enforce the racial order. Now, to really define what lynching is when the community feels that a person committed some offense. But it could be anything, right? It could be a serious crime. They could think you're a murderer. It could be rape. It could be attempted rape. That was a very common one, reason why people were lynched down south. Attempted rape, or just talking back to a white person, not knowing your place as a black person, kind of thinking you're above what you should be. These were the reasons why someone was lynched. So lynching was an extra legal killing of someone based on the community thinking that you did something. Now, breaches of the social code was usually the motivation. Now, just to give you some shocking stats, 1890, 85 blacks were lynched in the South. In 1895, it was 113. In 1900, it was 106. And lynching continued being a problem in the American South until good into the 20th century. And nothing was ever done. Remember, it's illegal, right? You're not allowed to just take people and kill them, right? Lynching, usually they got you from your house or wherever you were, or maybe you were already arrested. They got you from the jail. They strung you up on a horse and then hanged you from a tree. It was absolutely horrible. You're not allowed to do this. It's illegal to lynch people, but the southern legal system totally turned a blind eye to this. It was absolutely horrible, and the barbarism. If we were in class, I would show you some pictures, even though they're very hard to look at, of lynchings. Sometimes they cut parts of the body as souvenirs. Somebody burned the body, or burned you before you were dead. It was horrible. There's a big new lynching museum that was built in Montgomery, Alabama, to honor all the victims of lynching. I've never been to Alabama, but if I ever go, I really want to see that museum, even though it's it's definitely quite an emotional experience seeing that. I think they have a chair to represent every victim of lynching. So you're a black person in the South. Economically, you almost have nothing because you're a sharecropper. You're segregated in all public facilities from white people, and now you look the wrong way or whatever, attempting to vote, could potentially, which is our next topic, which should get you to a place where you're lynched. It was a horrendous situation. You were beset by violence, poverty, and unbelievable discrimination. The one right that black people did have that you would think would be protected by the law was the right to vote, right? The 15th Amendment guaranteed black men the right to vote. It says your right to vote cannot be taken from you based on your race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, Southerners decided that they had to strip blacks of the right to vote. If black people could vote for their leaders, then that could, that would certainly upset the whole social order politically, right? This is not talked about as much, but I remember reading an article maybe I was on vacation actually. It was like a few years ago, and it was basically trying to look at the origins of the law stripping black people the right to vote. And this thesis was that it was denying black people the right to vote was as much racial as it was political, because black people did not vote for the Democratic Party. Right? Most white people in the South were Democrats. Black people are not going to vote with Democrats. And the fear is that they would vote Republican, which could potentially, if they get enough white people along, could potentially vote out the Democrats in power. But in the 1890s, we're going to have a video about this sometime in May, but there was a party called the Populist Party that was created in the 1890s to unite poor farmers and poor workers, but mostly farmers, together, and because farmers were being so mistreated. And the Populist Party in the South was attempting to unite white people and black people together. This, saying that we're both being screwed by the power structure. So the thesis of this article I was reading, which was actually a book review, was that as much as it was racial, they didn't want black people to vote because they don't believe black people should have rights. But there was also a real fear that black people, if they voted, could potentially vote out the Democratic Party, political structure that was in place in the South, and especially with this new populist party being created in the 1890s that could unite white farmers and black farmers together. Now, race was used as a cynical political device by Democratic politicians in the South to divert people's attention away from real issues, like the fact that most of the South was living in grinding poverty, the white and black South. The fact that the government was not representing them well. The fact that the system was so rigged against regular people in the South. But using race was a way to distract people's attention away from the real problems, and the fact that the Democratic politicians are not dealing with those problems. So divert their attention with racial appeals, and that will get them to vote Democratic and kind of forget about all the problems that they have that the Democratic politicians are not being dealt with. Politicians to this day, unfortunately, continue to use that device, right? Trying to turn people against one another to distract attention away from real issues, right? To have people focus on, on guns or immigrants or race is still used, and that will divert people's attention away from the real economic problems. That's been a problem in American politics, forever, and starting, in the Jim Crow South, but certainly it's been mastered by a lot of politicians today, unfortunately. Now, if the 15th Amendment guarantees black people the right to vote, then if it guarantees black men, the right to vote, you can't just pass a law that says black people can vote, because that would clearly be a violation of the 15th Amendment. So they got clever. They thought of 3 devices to deny black people the right to vote. They didn't say, "Oh, it's not because you're black," but one provision that was in place in a lot of southern states was the grandfather clause. Now, the grandfather clause said you can't vote unless your grandfather voted. If you were a black person in the South, your grandfather was a slave, right? So obviously he did not have the right to vote. So that effectively denied black people the right to vote. Interestingly, this was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1915. It's so clearly unconstitutional, you can't even find any way to evade it. But 2 other methods the South used to deny black people the right to vote. One was a poll tax. So basically, charge people a tax before they could vote. Most black people in the South were very poor, so could certainly not afford, to to pay taxes to vote. Some people, if we're in class, I'm sure this question would come up. Doesn't that, I always get this, what about white people? There are a lot of white people in the South who were poor and couldn't afford the tax. But two things. One, Southern politicians reckoned that, they figured that, well, losing some white people is worth losing all black people. And also, a lot of these taxes were administered on a county level. So counties that, had big white populations sometimes didn't charge the tax, while counties that had a big black populations did. The other method that was used to deny black people the right to vote was a literacy test. Make black people take a very difficult test before they had the right to vote. You know, that often, well, depending on the state, literacy tests took one of two forms. One was asking them very complicated questions about the Constitution, about government, things that would be very difficult for the average person, particularly a person who doesn't have much education, to answer. Make the passing score 90 as opposed to 65. Or another type of test was a very difficult IQ test. I always give this out for people to take, where place a triangle in a circle, and how many E's do you see in this picture? It was kind of like IQ type tests. Now states sometimes had a combination of these methods. Sometimes they use one method over another. Some states preferred literacy tests to poll taxes, and so on. But the thing is that they effectively stripped almost all black people the right to vote in the South. So black people really didn't have full voting rights in the American South until the 1960s. So this was a terrible situation for black people. Economic stagnation, stuck as a sharecropper, physical violence, or always the threat of physical violence, segregation in all public places, and you don't have the right to vote. So this was complete second-class citizenship for African Americans. So this is the horrible, horrible legacy of the end of Reconstruction. All right, guys. So in our next video, we're going to talk about how black people attempted to respond to these terrible conditions in the American South, and the different ways that black people thought of to respond to this situation. This was really dark. Dark period in our country. And allowing all of this. Sharon once said about this, that race is America's constant curse, that we're always dealing with these racial problems and can never really kind of get past them. And that's true to a large degree, and the roots of it go back a very long way. Start with the beginning of our country's history, but certainly crystallized during these Jim Crow years in the late 19th and 20th century. All right, so I will see you in the next video. Hope you're all doing well. All right, see ya.